Ladies and gentlemen, תודה רבה לגברת ציפי לבני, וברשותכם אנחנו רוצים להמשיך בתוכנית. I have the pleasure and honor to invite Dr. Victoria Coates to the stage. Dr. Coates is the Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States and Senior Director for Middle Eastern Affairs at the White House. An art history scholar by training and foreign policy and national security consultant, her most recent book weaves together politics, art, and history, and it's titled David Sling, A History of Democracy in 10 Works of Art. However, I think today that we will not be talking about, regretfully perhaps, about art and history, but rather about contemporary Middle East. Dr. Coates, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Good sound? Thank you all for coming, and thank you for this very kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here at IDC at this august conference and have the opportunity to share some thoughts. I've been tracking the conference closely on Twitter, which is a very Trumpian thing to do, and have seen some very spirited discussions. I know a number of my colleagues across the administration, including my old boss, Jason Greenblatt, have had very productive engagements here. And I'm just pleased to have this opportunity, as I said, to share some of my perspective on current events in the Middle East. I thought the theme of this conference, the Navigating Stormy Waters, a Time for a New Course, was a very well chosen one. I'm not sure when that was selected. I don't know that we could have known when it was just how literally stormy the waters were going to be around the region when we came together. But of course, that is commanding everybody's attention. And so what I wanted to do today is put some of the president's actions and policies into this broader context because we are now 2.5 years into the administration. We have something of a track record, and I think we're starting to see some effects from it. And I call this kind of line of reasoning unconventional wisdom because, of course, we have a most unconventional president, something of which he is rightly proud, and those of us in his administration see this very much as a feature, not a bug, because it has given us an unprecedented opportunity to challenge cherished assumptions, particularly in the national security world. For example, in the national security strategy, we lay out that the historical trend toward liberal democracy is not evolutionary or inevitable. I think in the Cold War era, that was the natural sort of inclination, was to see progress toward democracy as something that would simply happen. History was on our side. All we had to do was wait. I think we now know, 25 years into the mission, that that is not the case, that we can promote liberalization, we can promote the kinds of economic and political policies we think are in the best interests of all humanity, but that is going to take work, and it's going to take hard work. We can't simply sit on the sidelines. And this administration thinks that nowhere in the Middle East are the fruits of that kind of hard work more apparent than here in Israel. As I'm fond now of pointing out to my Israeli colleagues, Israel has taken position number 8 on the U.S. News and World Report Index of the most powerful nations on the planet, which is certainly a testimony to the resilience and perseverance of the Israeli people, who have thrived and flourished despite some pretty formidable challenges in, admittedly, not the nicest of neighborhoods. And I want that to sort of foot stomp that point, because a lot of what I'll be talking about today is from the American perspective. We are not taking credit for this success. We are happy to have contributed to it, but this really is the success of Israel. The United States is proud to have played some role in this success through our long-standing and, importantly, bipartisan cooperation in a range of fields, bipartisan investment in Israel's security, and through our increasing cooperation in a range of fields, from cybersecurity to biotech to energy. Last week, we witnessed a remarkable manifestation of Israel's maturing stature when Prime Minister Netanyahu and his national security advisor, Meir Ben-Shabbat, hosted an historical trilateral meeting between the United States, Israel, and Russia. While we have, you'll not be surprised to learn, many areas of disagreement with our Russian friends, we're able to come out of this meeting with a clear mutual understanding that Israel's security is vital to the stability of the Middle East, and that is indeed historic. What I'd like to do today is address three major actions that President Trump has taken that have decisively altered the course of U.S. strategy toward the Middle East. These would be the decision to withdraw from the Jcpoa, the decision to move the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and the decision to recognize the Golan Heights as sovereign Israeli territory. It's important to recognize that none of these actions were taken lightly or impulsively. While there were some who urged the president to do them on day one of his administration, he chose a more deliberative approach as his new administration gained its footing. Still, all three were roundly condemned when they were made, frequently in a bipartisan fashion, because they challenged venerable assumptions about Middle East policy. Now the administration is not so new. We can look back at these decisions and take stock of the outcome, which have been quite different from the dire predictions that accompanied them. So starting with the Jcpoa withdrawal, a little over a year ago, the president took a decisive action that was widely predicted to be a catastrophe for American foreign policy by withdrawing from the Jcpoa. The agreement had been negotiated by the so-called P5+1, with the European also playing a central role. And so the nations of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom essentially participated both as individual countries and as members of the EU. And the agreement was then implemented by a United Nations Security Council resolution, not, as we've noted, ratified by the elected legislatures of any of the participants except, ironically, Iran's. The Jcpoa is thus a monument to the so-called international rules-based order, which appears to mean a utopian global community in which international organizations preempt the sovereignty of individual nations, ostensibly for a greater good. That is the article of faith the president violated by deciding to withdraw from the plan of action. But, as the history of the Jcpoa demonstrates, the best intentions can go awry when one of the participants, in this case Iran, has no respect for order of any kind, let alone the intention to abide by the guidance of an international organization, unless it aligns precisely with Iran's own self-interests. Recognizing that the faults and the limitations of the Jcpoa hugely outweighed any limited delay to Iran's nuclear weapons program, and that by abiding by it, the United States prevented ourselves from imposing the decisive economic pressure necessary to actually change Iran's behavior, the president concluded his responsibility for the security of the American people made it necessary to withdraw. In the lead up to the announcement to withdraw from the Jcpoa on May 8, 2018, it was predicted with great certainty that abrogating the agreement would isolate the United States, provoke more aggressive investment in and cooperation with Iran, and accelerate its nuclear breakout. And I have a couple of choice quotes from the period. If I'm quoting somebody in the room, you can come up and yell at me afterwards. Nader Habibi, a professor of economics at the Middle East at Brandeis University, said that the pullout from the nuclear agreement would threaten American ties with Europe. He noted that soon after Trump's announcement of sanctions, Federica Mogherini, who heads the European Union's foreign policy portfolio, said that the EU stands committed to the nuclear agreement and that it will try to preserve it as much as possible. Quote, that represents a rift between the U.S. and its allies. In a foreign policy article ominously titled, "Leaving the Iran Nuclear Deal Will Have Unintended Consequences," Elizabeth Rosenberg wrote, "Not every foreign company, bank, or oil trader will be inclined to comply with the U.S. sanctions, particularly if their own governments are frustrated with the U.S. reimposition of sanctions. There is no multilateral interest now in targeting Iran with financial pressure and diplomatic isolation, unlike during the 2012 and 2015 period of most intensive global sanctions on Iran. Now there will be far more opportunities to cheat if the rest of the world does not cooperate with the U.S. sanctions. That lack of cooperation will make it harder to enforce the sanctions. Government and analysts or foreign partners may not collect or share intelligence on evasion with the U.S. government as they did in the past. They may also stand in the way of efforts to enforce the sanctions by impeding U.S. official access to violators to try to convince them to desist." The President heard these arguments, importantly, from our allies and extended the congressional waivers a second time to give those allies the additional time they needed to fix the JCPOA. But when they failed to do so, he made the announcement that the United States would no longer participate in the agreement. This triggered an additional 6-month wind-down period before the reimposition of sanctions on November 6th of last year, accompanied by 8 6-month SREs for countries who imported significant Iranian oil, the point being that, again, this was a very deliberate process. And 1 year after the announcement, with the benefit of hindsight, here's what actually has happened. The status of our European alliances is unchanged. Iran has remained up until this week in the JCPOA. Iran's neighbors stand with Israel and the United States in recognizing Tehran as the greatest threat to the region's security. The Iranian economy is collapsing under the weight of the unilateral U.S. sanctions, with inflation and exchange rates at near record highs, and the regime is unable to respond to internal disasters. The IRGC has been forced to slash funding to terrorist proxies in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, leaving them to lament that, quote, "the golden days are gone and will never return." The price of oil is roughly where it was when we made our announcement to withdraw, due to the dramatic increase of the United States' domestic production and coordination with other major energy-producing nations. And then, in addition, especially since the May 8th anniversary, the President has embarked on a series of unprecedented actions beyond the reimposition of the existing sanctions regimes, such as designating the IRGC a terrorist group, sanctioning Iran's steel, aluminum, and copper sectors, and also sanctioning their petrochemical industry that will stop the Iranian economy in its tracks. President Trump's stated goal for our Iran strategy is to fundamentally change the Iranian regime's behavior so it no longer threatens the United States and our allies, and it never possesses a nuclear weapon. Whether Tehran chooses a future of opportunity and prosperity for the Iranian people, or doubles down on the failed policies of the last 40 years that brought it to this impasse, has yet to be seen. But the regime has a well-documented history of engaging in violent terrorism to further its policies, a pattern to which it has returned in recent weeks. But the President will not have his policies be held hostage by Iran, and he has demonstrated beyond any doubt that the United States retains unprecedented economic clout that will eventually cripple Iran if the regime does not change course. The designation of the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization and bringing the SREs to zero until Iran is compelled to negotiate on terms favorable to the U.S. or choose between survival and exporting terror, because it will not be able to do both. Turning to the Jerusalem embassy move, a personal favorite of mine, something we've worked on for a number of years. As a candidate, President Trump repeatedly promised to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That pledge had been a popular bipartisan campaign talking point for decades, as generations of presidents quietly issued 28 successive waivers to postpone its actual implementation. The rationale was clear. While symbolically desirable to move the embassy and popular domestically, the security challenges were too great for any responsible commander-in-chief to countenance. In the lead up to the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel on December 6, 2017, it was predicted with high confidence, indeed with near certainty, that Israel would be instantly isolated in the Middle East and risked renewed war with the Arabs after the announcement. The Palestinian Authority would be forced by an outraged public to launch a third intifada against Israel. In fact, a policy designed to bolster Israel would actually undermine Israel's security from both within and without. One U.S. official predicted that if Trump makes such a move, it could spark demonstrations or violence by the Palestinians or by Muslims around the world, in part because of the sensitivity of Jerusalem. Another U.S. official said that the consensus U.S. intelligence estimate on U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital was that it would risk triggering a backlash against Israel and also potentially against U.S. interests in the Middle East. Richard H. Jones, who was ambassador to Israel from 2005 to 2009 under Mr. Bush, warned that groups like Hamas and the Islamic State would exploit the issue to incite violence, and predicted that the Palestinian Authority would step up international efforts to boycott and condemn Israel. Quote, "This is a risky move, which no doubt will cost lives in Israel and the region, particularly as Israeli settlers use it to justify accelerating their activity." The president heard these arguments, which were made sincerely, and took them seriously, as did his administration. But after renewing the national security waiver required by the Jerusalem Recognition Act of 1994 to allow for 6 additional months of deliberation, he made the final decision to move the embassy. All responsible steps were taken to ensure the safety and security of American citizens and our assets, and President Trump made clear that the United States was not taking a position on final status issues. But 6 months after the announcement, the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem officially opened on May 14, 2018, 1 week after the withdrawal from the Jcpoa and on the 70th anniversary of the founding of Israel. Media coverage of the ceremony showed a split screen with scenes of rioting Palestinians and the actual ceremonies, which seemed visual evidence that the predictions of disaster were coming true. Reporting that ignored the simple fact that the riots were in Gaza, not Jerusalem, or indeed anywhere in the West Bank, and were completely unrelated to the location of the American embassy. As days and weeks have gone on and calm held, it became clear that the opposite was true. And less than 6 months after the embassy opened, Prime Minister Netanyahu made his first official visit to the capital of an Arab country, Oman, with little or no response from the Arab street. Israel participated in the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum last January in Cairo, which resulted in an agreement between Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and Italy to collectively develop their natural gas resources. And I'm very pleased that they're going to be meeting again this month. Israeli athletes won 22 medals at the Special Olympics in Dubai in March of 2019. Just this week, Foreign Minister Israel Katz led the Israeli delegation to Abu Dhabi to participate in a UN meeting on climate. And perhaps most momentously, the Bahraini Foreign Minister Sheikh Khalid bin Ahmed Al Khalifa told Israeli journalist Barak Ravid that, quote, "Israel is a country in the Middle East. The Jewish people have a place among us." A simple admission of fact that would have been unimaginable a few years ago. In fact, rather than being isolated and attacked, Israel now enjoys the warmest relations with its neighbors that it has in its history, which, encouraged by the United States, appears to be strengthening even further. Finally, I'd like to talk briefly about the recognition of Golan, President Trump's third and most recent action to reshape U.S. policy toward Israel in the Middle East, was the recognition of the Golan Heights as sovereign Israeli territory on March 25th of this year. The history of the Golan is well known to everyone in this room, so there's no reason to rehash it here. But President Trump's interest in the matter has been longstanding. In March, however, we had the New York Times reporting that Hezbollah was establishing a major terror cell in the Golan, making it once again a likely site for attacks against Israel. And after the revelation of the Hezbollah terror tunnels under the Israeli-Lebanon border last year, he decided this threat was too acute and it was time to take action and recognize the reality that this territory, captured in a defensive action and under Israeli control for decades, is in fact part of Israel and central to Israel's security. Once again, we had dire predictions of disaster. The action was condemned as, quote, yet another terrible idea about the Middle East that would destroy the most important principle of the UN Charter. Alan Baker, director of the Institute of Contemporary Affairs at the Jerusalem Center of Public Affairs, argued that there was no legal way to take territory by force, even in a defensive action. I was personally demarched by the E3, something I normally would not talk about in these circumstances, but it was reported in Axios. It seemed like they were coming in once a week for a while. And my favorite part of the démarche was when one of the representatives leaned forward and said, we would never ask Israel to give it back. We understand, but you can't do this. Given this apparently conclusive analysis, one would assume that the president's action would have been roundly refuted by, if nothing else, a strongly worded United Nations Security Council resolution and condemned by the Arab League, supported by the broader international community. Once again, President Trump's impulsive action would have the reverse of the intended effect, and Israel would ultimately be punished through increased isolation and condemnation. Once again, no such thing happened. Days after the president's announcement, the Arab League met in Tunis and did not readmit Syria. The United Nations has not unilaterally imploded. In fact, the anger that was supposed to be directed toward the US and Israel in the aftermath of this decision has utterly failed to materialize, because rather than being a savage attack on the principles of international law, the president's action was a simple recognition of reality. In all these three cases, the president's willingness to state simple truths has made many uncomfortable. It is indeed unsettling that an international agreed-upon joint plan of action enacted by a United Nations Security Council resolution has not made Iran a responsible member of the rules-based order. But we have to confront this reality if we are ever going to actually change Iran's behavior. Removing the deliberately constructed ambiguities around Israel's status is for some an unwelcome reality check. But from the United States' perspective, we are starting to see some material benefits from these policies. And part of what will be the president's lasting legacy is fundamentally changing the arguments around these issues. It can no longer be argued that moving the US embassy to Jerusalem will weaken and isolate Israel. And the same holds true for the recognition of Golan. It can no longer be argued that economic relief or engagement with the international community will effectively change Tehran's behavior. And it cannot be argued that unilateral US economic sanctions are an ineffective tool of statecraft. If arguments are going to be made against President Trump's policies, there are going to have to be new ones. But it is our hope that as these policies develop a track record, we can all benefit from the new perspective they are giving us on the region to not only confront the many challenges it poses, but also to seize some of the unprecedented opportunities before us. Thank you very much.